You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, and 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 why that's so.
Yali no Chime, and welcome to Tales from Aztlantis, the show where we explore Mesoamerican pseudo-history, New Age nonsense, and other stories of adventure. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa
and Ruben Arellano, also known as Tlacatecat.
Episode 5, Juan Tejeda. Greetings, dear listeners. This is Kurly Tlapoyawa, and I am excited to announce that today on this episode, we have our very first guest. So allow me to introduce Mr. Juan Tejeda. Juan Tejeda retired in 2016 as a professor of Mexican-American Studies and Music from Palo Alto College in San Antonio, Texas. A musician, writer, arts administrator, and Chicano activist. From 1976 to 1985, he was the jefe segundo of Xinachtli, the first traditional Mexica-Azteca Conchero dance group in Texas. And from 1980 to 1998, he was the Chicano Music Program Director at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center in San Antonio. He is the button accordionist and vocalist with Conjunto Aztlan, and along with his wife, Anisa Onofre, is the co-owner and publisher of Aztlan Libre Press. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Juan Tejeda. It is a pleasure to have you with us.
Glad to be here. I didn't know I was your first guest. I feel honored to be here with you, Kurly, and with Tlacatecat here.
Well, we're very glad to have you.
Absolutely.
So I was very interested in getting you on the show because Ruben had informed me that at one point in your life you had taken a class at UT Austin, I believe, with Juan Luna Cardenas. And Juan Luna is an individual that we've discussed briefly before on the show, and we're going to get deeper into him because, you know, all of these things that we're talking about in regards to the tradición and Mexicayot, you know, all of these different strings that we can follow, they all seem to go back to certain individuals in Mexico over a certain time frame. And Juan Luna Cardenas is one of those individuals. But before we go into that, I would like you to just, if you would, just tell us a bit about yourself and what it is that you do now. I know you're retired, so congratulations. But I know you also run a publishing company, so that's really fascinating as well. So if you could just give us a little bit of background on who you are and your history.
Yeah, thank you. I just retired as a professor of Mexican-American Studies and Music from Palo Alto College, excuse me, Palo Alto College here in San Antonio, Texas, back in 2016. So a little over 4 years now, retired and active in the development of Chicano Studies and Mexican-American Studies here in Texas, and a writer, a musician with Conjunto Aztlan, as you mentioned, and my wife and I have owned and co-published Aztlan Libre Press. You see some of the books behind me here on the screen that we've published in the past. We've published 14 books over the last little over 10 years, focusing on primarily Native American Chicano literature and art. But I got involved in the Chicano movement when I went from high school here in San Antonio to the University of Texas in Austin, and really kind of experienced Chicano studies and the Chicano movement for the first time in my life. Right out of high school, took my first Chicano studies course and got hooked, got involved in the Chicano movement. I said, why haven't they taught me this before? Here, 12 years of school, nothing about my history except a lot of negative stuff, and my language and my culture and the arts and so forth. So I got turned on and did a lot of work there. Got involved with CASA, was Chicano Art Students Association, back in 1972, 73, when I first started there. That became later Chicanos Artistas Sirviendo Aztlan. And then took all of the Chicano Studies courses, eventually graduated with my Bachelor of Arts in Chicano Studies and English with a minor in education, because I wanted to be a teacher and teach Chicano Studies. But they wouldn't let me teach Chicano Studies in Texas because it wasn't a certified teaching discipline in the state. And you needed 2 certified teaching disciplines to be able to become a teacher. Nonetheless, got involved and worked with different organizations there in East Austin and amongst the Raza with the Brown Berets, and Lucha, the League of United Chicano Artists, and began Danza back then, the first traditional Mexica-Azteca dance group in Texas, Xinachtli. We were searching for our indigenous roots during the Chicano movement. And of course, being Mexicanos within the United States and in Texas, Tejanos, the whole Mexica-Azteca was being, I think, glorified to a great extent. First by Mexico itself, obviously, because the nation state, once it gained its independence from Spain, right, in 1821, became the nation of Mexico, right, Mexico. So obviously that was the capital city of the Aztec Mexica Empire. So in a lot of ways, the whole Aztecismo was glorified by the Mexican nation. And so, years later within the Chicano movement, so it became also the Aztec tropes, the Mexica, the danza was starting to spread here in the United States back in the early 70s. I know that in California, we under Xinachtli were under el mando espiritual de Capitán General Andrés Segura Granados. And as far as I know, he was one of the first, if not the first, that introduced danza over there in California, even before, I think, Yescas, what was his name?
Florencio
Yescas began his group there. Andrés Segura had already come up here to California and to Texas also, in different capacities and with the White Roots of Peace.
Right.
And of course, representing la tradición de la danza de los concheros. So we hooked up with him through Ballet Folclórico Aztlán de Texas that was in Austin under the directorship of La Señora María Salinas. And she knew Andrés Segura. And then took Jose Flores, who is still the Capitán de Xinachtli there outside of Austin, where he has his oratorio. Took him to meet Andrés Segura first, and then came back with, a sort of a mando to formalize the group. Then all of us went to our first ceremonia in Mexico, which was El Señor de Chalma, right around May, the cardinal point to the south of the danza. And the toughest ceremonia, because it's a 4-day ceremonia, all the other ones are really just 1 day, speaking of danza. And that's where we met, I met personally, and a lot of our other members in the group of Xinachtli, that we had started rehearsing and even had some danza presentations with La Señora Salinas. But once we met Andrés Segura on that first trip to Chalma, things kind of changed, right? It was pretty heavy.
Do you remember what year that was?
That was, it must have been I would say around when we met Andres, because we had already done some danza before and had been involved with this group for about a year more. So it must have been around, and I'm gonna have to go back and check my dates in my journals, but it must have been about 75 or 76, you know?
Okay.
But I have to check exactly on that day. Some people put it that it was a little bit later, but I'm convinced that it wasn't. So I'll have to check my journals.
Well, there's an article, very well cited article that's been, a lot of the people that have done studies and articles on danza have looked at this article by Poveda. I forget his first name, but he in that article, Pablo Poveda, and in that article, he is interviewing Segura, and Segura affirms, like, to him that he had been coming up to Texas since the late 60s, like 68, 69, and that he had started initially the first Xinachtli sometime around 69, maybe early 70. So it was pretty early in the Chicano movement that danza arrived, at least here in Texas. California is a different story because you have competing narratives. Some people claim that it was actually Florencio Yescas who was the first one to introduce. And then you have people say, well, actually, it was actually Segura who came in first. So it's a little difficult. But, it's besides the point. The point is that by the early, Chicano movement days, danza was already making its way into Aztlan. And so it's, I guess, what we want to know is, like, your experience, like, through danza and how that led you in it to, like, your perspective from those days of the danza conchera with Andres Segura, and how that translated to your studies that you ended up taking at UT, and that led to taking courses with Juan Luna Cardenas. Maybe we can try to draw that parallel there.
Yeah, and I do want to mention, while I had heard that Andres Segura had come up here even in the late 60s with White Roots of Peace and other groups, and he had some friends here. And while there were maybe some people that danced with him, I don't think that a group was really formed of Mexica-Azteca danza, de los concheros here, that early on. That's why I said that I believe that really our group was the first one in Texas, even back in around 1975 when we sort of met Andres Segura, 75, 76, and then formed officially a group under his charge, under his capitania, and leadership under Xinachtli, the name of his group also. But I had not really heard of a group that was established here in Texas. And I'm originally from San Antonio, though it was in Austin that we established that group. Mm-hmm. So again, us, part of the Chicano movement, and really turned on and all in Chicano Studies there at the University of Texas in Austin, searching for our indigenous roots that in a lot of ways had been taken away from us, right? The danza came to us really in a lot of ways, but we were doing, art exhibits, formed the Conjunto Aztlan, a conjunto musical del movimiento Chicano, using traditional conjunto instruments, but lyrics of the Chicano movement, social protest and so forth. And it was during that phase, we're poets. We had a murals program there in East Austin, worked with different organizations, as I mentioned. And in this search for our roots, the danza came to us, and we got heavily involved. I was in it for about 9 years as the jefe segundo of Xinachtli until I got out of the group for different reasons back in the mid 80s. But I was looking through some records, and I know that y'all were mentioning that Juan Luna Cardenas. Well, of course, I was taking every Chicano Studies class that existed at the University of Texas in Austin. Like I said, I ended up getting my degree in Chicano Studies. And right when I graduated in 1978 with my BA in Chicano Studies, Dr. Arnoldo Ventos, who was the director of the Center for Mexican American Studies there at UT Austin at the time, brought up Dr. Juan Luna Cardenas as an academic in residence. And in fact, he brought him up with a big sort of title that there was some controversy over that at the time, that some people didn't want to bring him up because of his credentials, supposedly, but he was a visiting professor and current Tinker Professor of Latin American Studies. And that Tinker Professor of Latin American Studies was a big deal there at the University of Texas, right? But always from the beginning, there was some controversy over him. And anyway, I think he was there for about a year. And I believe that we took his first course, in fact, 2 courses the very first semester. And I had already graduated, but I decided I'm going to take these courses because I had never studied under a Mexica-Azteca professor, right? And the 2 courses were in the spring of 1979. It was Sociedad Azteca, and the second course was Azteca Nahuatl. And they were, pretty interesting. I would say sort of beginning level courses, introductory courses to Azteca Nahuatl and La Sociedad Azteca. And as I mentioned, I'll make copies of this. I'm going to make a copy of the syllabi of both of these courses for you, so you can say, but pretty basic, We were excited. It was a relatively small class, maybe about 12, 13 students. But you just, in terms of La Sociedad Azteca, for instance, he had reaction to traditional texts, ideas to history, assessment and change, fundamental concepts of culture, abode, food, dress, thoughts, organization of society, primitive developed society in the Americas, Chico Mostok and pre-Stone Age, and food and eating habits, artifacts, dress, Aztec society, family, clan, language, legends, history, other tribes, science, mathematics, concepts of life.
That's a lot.
Yeah, religion. It was kind of a total overview, right? Religion.
Was he relying exclusively on books that he had written as the textbooks?
It was, in fact, his required texts are right here in the syllabi: Compendio de Gramática Azteca, Historia Patria, and Matemática de los Aztecas. All
They're
written
both
by
his.
him.
Yeah.
And then he had other reference books like Daniel Brinton, Efalba Xochitl, Diego Duran, Danilo Sahagún, Bartolome, the kind of the Espanol, what they call sort of primary sources now, but aren't really necessarily primary. I think they're secondary. And the 2 exams were going to be required. Yeah, so it was, and the same thing, of course, with Azteca Nahuatl. It was an overview and breaking down the language and seeing how it related, how many Aztequismos and words were within even the Spanish language, and then getting down into, the adjectives, the sentence structure, the pronouns. I got kind of technical, and but there were interesting classes. First time, I think, that the University of Texas had brought in somebody like him to teach courses in Nahuatl and in Sociedad Azteca.
So when you say that there was a controversy over his credentialing, do you remember what the issue was exactly about his credentials?
I was a young student, and while I heard about the controversy about his credentials, and ultimately they approved him, obviously, because he came up for that year or so that he was the Tinker Professor in Latin American Studies, a visiting professor. But on the side over here, and I didn't know all the details, basically saying that some of his work was suspect, right? Mm-hmm. And I vaguely remember, and maybe didn't have the academic sources and
the training, the rigor that it takes to really assess that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly.
So do you remember anything from those courses that you'd be willing to share with us?
And that was over 40 years ago.
Okay. It's been a while. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I said. I found this notebook from back then because I'm doing some work also. I'm getting some of my old stuff, and I went over it. But it was some basic information that was good for us at the time. We were already, 2 or 3 years into the danza, and we had not studied under anybody except for Andres Segura. We did when we went to Mexico, or when he came to Austin a couple of times to be with a group and do presentations. But we had not studied with anybody else. He was first. And I should mention that at that time, also, we came into contact when Tlacayelel came up from Mexico, and he associated with our group Xinachtli and did ceremonia with us. And we also, attended some of his presentations. And in fact, he stayed at my house and he stayed at Jose Flores. He had a group of young sort of danzantes, but they used to dress all in white in the old traditional Mexica, like in the codices when they would dance. And of course we had the plumas and the colorful vestuario de la tradición, right? And they were very, very basic, sort of macehual.
Were they doing danza conchera, or was their danza different from?
And they did danza with us, and we did danza with them, and it was basically danza,
Okay.
Conchera. I think when you get down to the bottom of it, even all these Mexicayot and Mexica grupo de danza, they're really coming from the same root, and I think that it's the tradition de los concheros, right?
Right.
Some of the groups decided to try to decolonize the tradition of the concheros and not use the concha, for instance, and just use the huehue, the traditional instruments, y los pasos de la danza. But I don't think that you could ever completely decolonize, even la danza on certain levels. I mean, most of the cantos out of necessity were done in Espanol, even though there've always been traditional Nahuatl cantos that still exist, right?
Well, and then even looking at it from the perspective of decolonizing it, right? Because danza didn't really become part of the Mexicayot, that the way that we know it with the MCRCA, with Samanahuac, Tlamachtiloyan, until like the late 70s, I think, is when they really started bringing in danza. And in their attempt to decolonize it, quote unquote, they got rid of all the trappings, or most of the trappings of the concheros. But what's unfortunate about that is those conchero teachings had a lot of knowledge buried in them that was indigenous. Right. So by getting, superficially, it looked Catholic, or it had the veneer of Catholicism. And so they got rid of it. But in doing that, they also lost this connection to a lot of deeply held knowledge that was there. In my opinion, I think that's what happened. And I think it's kind of unfortunate because when I was young, I was really drawn to the danza, right? And when I was living in Mexico City, everybody would dance so fast. Like the drumming is like listening to a machine gun, just da-ga-da, da-ga-da, da-ga-da. And when I was young, that really appealed to me because, if you were going to be the best dancer, you had to dance the fastest and the most athletic and this and that. Now I get older, I'm like, man, I just want to dance slow.
Well, yeah. Go ahead.
And just enjoy it more, right? And make it meaningful to me instead of like feel like I'm performing for people to kind of judge me on my abilities. Just block all that out and tell the drummers like, hey, slow it down, man. We got time.
See some of the grupos over there in Mexico in the ceremonias to los Cuatro Vientos y el Centro. The older groups, they dance slower, right? Not as fast. Andres Segura used to call the young, really showy groups that used to dance out in the plaza and sometimes even out in the centros, at night where they had bars and stuff. So then for money, used to call them La Tropa Loca, that they were all coming from the tradición, right, de los concheros, but then had aberrated and was doing things outside of la tradición. If there was anything, Andres Segura was a very traditionalist, and you have to do things the way the tradition teaches you. That's what a tradition is. You can't just on your own aberrate and do things that are not part of the tradition. And this was one of the things that he had. He didn't get along with Juan Luna Cardenas or with Tlacayele, even though like Tlacayele, like I said, was doing danza de la tradición. I mean, you could tell they were, right? And we danced with them, they danced with our group. But yet, here again, another one of those that were kind of trying to decolonize la tradición de los concheros and try to just go to the basic supposed teachings that they got that were más Mexica-Azteca. Right. But there was bronca with Andres, with Tlacayele, and even with Juan Luna Cardenas about some of his teachings, and with Florencio Yesca. And he always complained that Florencio out of California, and I don't know if he was there, that he was folklorizing la tradición and doing things that weren't part of the tradition and performing in clubs, for instance, and sticking their foot in the samador and in the fire. He says, Wayne, have you ever seen the tradición and people de la tradición do things like that, you know? A strict traditionalist. Of course, we were bajo his mando, so we always sided with Andres. And we believed in his teachings, the teachings de la tradición, you know, up until people got out for different reasons. But the group has existed, you know, for over 40 years and still exists here in Texas.
Do you recall, like, around what year Tlacayele showed up in Texas and in Austin? Was it in 76, 77?
Right around there, man. You
okay.
know, because we had started danza, and it was right about the time right before I left.
Well, because according to some of the research that we've done, it was actually Miguel Angel Mendoza, who goes by Cuauhcuat, and who founded the Semanahuac Tlamachtiloyan in Mexico City, who was one of the first people who really promoted this idea of decolonizing danza and initiating what we now come to know as danza mexica. And that's sometime around 76, 77. So that would have been around the same time that Tlacayele was also beginning to sort of split from, because both Tlacayele and Cuauhcuat split from the MCRCA in the mid 70s, like around that time, and they started going off in their own direction. And so Cuauhcuat went more into like the danza mexica, you know, branch of it, and Tlacayele took it a whole different direction. I mean, was Tlacayele, when he came to Texas from back in the mid 70s, do you recall him promoting this idea of the Sundance being a mexica tradition that needed to be reinstated in Mexico and so on? Is that something that you recall from back then?
I have a vague recollection of that, of them obviously trying to make this connection with Los Indios del Norte, you know, that we were related all the way up to, and I have a vague recollection of them, you know, trying to promote the unity, the Los Indios up here north with the Mexica-Azteca tradition, and somehow the Sundance was in there, but I couldn't tell you exactly right now.
So he wasn't really like trying to push it on y'all when he came up with this group of danzantes.
No, and you know, we at that same time, you know, we had also connected with the American Indian movement, you know, as part of the Chicano movement, and done some ceremonies with different native groups from the north, right? And in fact, what was his name, out of Oklahoma? I can't think of it right now. His name, I'll think about it later. But also, as we moved into 1978, and I think it was Arnold Vento people that started El Canto al Pueblo. You remember that over there in Milwaukee? I think was the first one. And then they had the Canto al Pueblo in 78 in Arizona. And that's where we met Leonard Crow Dog. And it's kind of like Chicanos and Mexicanos and other nations and tribes from the south meeting from nations to the north, and kind of the beginning at that time of the sort of the union of the eagle and the condor, right, of the whole continent, the indigenous continent. And that was the first time we did a ceremony with Leonard Crow Dog from the Sioux, peyote ceremony, and we did danza there and connected with different groups. So we already had, is what I'm saying, these connections with some native nations and people to the north and the American Indian movement. So that Tlacaelel came through, and even Andres, I think they had this concept of this pan-indigena, continental movement, right? That we were united, and we are, by sangre, by the original people of this continent, different tribes, different clans, different nations throughout the continent of America, both north and south, and that we were related as original people. So Tlacaelel had it, so he kind of fit naturally with our group. We were having connection with different people, Juan Luna, Andres. We connected with people from California de la Danza who danced with Florencio Yescas. They came here. Some of our people went there, and we danced with them in Austin. Azteca, you remember Azteca, and Guillermo El Venao, and Tupac Enrique, these people. So we were connecting, right? Later, and of course, though, the one thing about all these people, Andres, Juan Luna Cardenas, Tlacaelel, the people that we met that danced with Florencio Yescas, it was Mexica, it was Mexica-Azteca tradición de danza de los concheros. There was this unity that bound us, even though, both Juan Luna and Tlacaelel wanted to, that said, sort of decolonize la tradición de la danza. And that was sort of the bronca that Andres Segura had with everybody.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to ask you what Luna Cardenas thought about the danza conchera and vice versa. What how that interaction played out between Tlacaelel, Cardenas, and Segura. What that dynamic of that, having those people all in the same room. What was that like?
No, well, they were never in the same room.
Okay.
Straight, we had their influences at different time, but I never had any of them together. None of those.
Oh, okay.
Kind of.
I was picturing this. I had this idea that.
I would have been a nice encounter at that time.
No, that's.
But they all knew of each other. And
They
they were
knew
aware
each
of
other through their writings, through their presentations, through their teachings, supposedly. And they didn't get along. None of them.
Really? Because I would have thought that maybe Juan Luna Cardenas would have gotten along with Tlacaelel in terms of, I know Juan Luna really wanted to sort of revitalize the religion, right? The Azteca Mexica religion, and I know Tlacaelel was along those same lines. So I would have thought they would have gotten along.
I guess they would have.
But,
I know more that Andres sort of didn't get along with them. Juan Luna Cardenas, he would come to our danza ceremonias, and we hooked up. Yeah, we hooked up with him. Like at certain poetry classes that we had, and he even read some poetry in Nahuatl at some of these classes, and critiqued us. He was our profe at that time too, right? But he never, as I recall, and not even Tlacaelel for that matter, sort of badmouthed Andres Segura or the tradición. Although we understood, and it probably came up, with the concha, because Tlacaelel didn't use the concha in his danzas, right? They had the drum, they had the sonajas, and they did, some of the similar danzas. Juan Luna Cardenas, while I think he respected the tradición and the danza, and of course all of the artists, he never, he wasn't a danzante himself, he never, as far as I remember, criticized La Danza de los Concheros or our group that much, All of them, I should say, were really interested in promoting the grandeza de, los Mexica-Aztecas, right? And their civilization, and that this move to kind of go back to the past and institute their values, their society, their culture, their way of thinking, even their religion that they had, the little that they taught us. So I think it was an important move for us, and it was important that we understood that we had the influence of all these people and that we met both, even Florencio and his people and Tlacael and Juan Luna. And I think we could agree that it was important that we go back and search for our indigenous roots and to study it and to be part of these tradiciones and this whole sort of movement towards decolonization, which we were in agreement with, but little by little we started understanding the nuances of how colonization had affected us and the different things that had resulted, including the name concheros and the concha, the instrument itself, which was probably, and the Spanish language and Catholicism and all of that. And we were ourselves trying to decolonize and go back little by little. And I think one of the reasons why I stopped dancing at the time, there was different things, family things and stuff, but I wasn't convinced that, then we found out, amongst the Mexicans, amongst Chicanos, we come from a whole lot of different indigenous traditions and culturas, not just the Aztec, right? And for me personally, that became one of the things that I wanted to kind of look. I sense I don't think I'm an Aztec, and I'm going to go back and try to find my true roots, my true indigenous roots, even though realizing that there was this whole, mestizaje that I was part of, and this, syncretic culture and this fusion and hybrid culture that we as Chicanos represented. But those were very formative years with La Danza and connecting us to our roots and the ceremonias and this sort of indigenous spirituality and even religion was very important. I think that kind of completed something that the Chicano movement needed at that time, right? That connection not only to the land, to our indigenous roots, but the spirituality and that ceremony and religious element that we had been, disconnected from.
Well, to follow up on
Absolutely.
that, I think you might have sort of answered it in a way, but maybe more directly. Can you sort of touch upon how Luna Cardenas or Tlacael or Segura, how they felt about Chicanos reclaiming their indigeneity?
Well, I can tell you that Andres Segura, he gave Chicanos and the Chicano movement high praise. And in fact, he said things like that the Chicanos were más mexicanos que los mexicanos because we were trying to reclaim our Mexican culture, right?
Yeah.
And feel positive about it as part of the Chicano movement and our arts, right? And going back to Nahuatl, he goes, when not even a lot of the Mexicans are doing that, they've been so disconnected through colonization, right? But he even, I think, said at one time that he felt that the Chicano movement and Chicanos were going to be like the salvation of Mexico. But he always knew that we were of the same people, and in fact, the larger Pan-American Indígena movement, but specifically with the Chicano people, had a very close affinity. He knew that we were the same people. Just the border had crossed us, right? And more so than we had crossed the border. So, he started about 4 or 5 groups here in the United States, Andres Segura, including the very first one with the Teatro Campesino when he came way back. And then a couple of other groups there in California, and then one in New Mexico, and then here in Texas. So his influence was very important, I think, to the Chicano movement, Chicano people in general. I think that Juan Luna Cardenas also realized this very important connection between, Mexico and the Chicanos and the larger indigenous peoples movement throughout the continent. And so did Tlacael. I think all of them did realize, and that's why they came up here, right? that's why they went up north also, and following and teaching and connecting with different groups and cultural groups and danza groups and movement groups, and giving their platicas and their teachings and connecting with the Native American movement and indigenous people up here in the north. I mean, and especially the Chicano movement, because, you know, we're connected really, you know, in so many different ways, more so than, you know, the Sioux up there, even though we're connected to the Mexica and Nahuatl. They talk about connections with, you know, through language and the trade routes and so forth. But we are Mexicanos, right? So there was that special bond.
Yeah, and getting back to what you were saying about, you know, we come from a multitude of indigenous groups, right? Not just the Azteca, but, you know, when during that time, the formative period of Chicano identity, you know, our ability to reconnect was limited by access, right? Like, and the fact that it was Azteca, Mexica, Conchero, like this was what was available, and it resonated with us, so that's what we got involved with. And I think danza is really powerful and useful in that way, because it allows people to reconnect in a way that's meaningful to them. And then they start learning more about their culture and their history, and which part of Mexico did their family come from, and which communities are they related to. Personally, and I doubt anybody agrees with me, I think we should stop calling it Danza Azteca. I think we should just call it Xinachtli or something else, because, you know, by tying it to Azteca, we're kind of like, you know, limiting the perspective of the people involved with it. And I think Xinachtli is just as, you know, tying it to the Masewali, the identity of just being indigenous people to Mexico. But I wanted to ask you, you said, what year was it that you got your bachelor's in Chicano Studies? 78. Wow. I didn't even know that they had like degrees available in Chicano Studies in 1978.
They did,
That's
and in
wild.
fact, it was Dr. Americo Paredes who started the Center for Mexican American Studies at UT Austin in 1971 or 72. And shortly thereafter, you know, it's interesting because he started the Center for Mexican American Studies, but the degree program that they started, the BA, was in Chicano Studies. I know because it was during those years. I got there in 72, right, when he had started the Center for Mexican Studies. And I knew, hey, there's a Chicano Studies degree, a BA here, you know, at the Center for Mexican American Studies. And I took all of the courses in Chicano Studies, you know. And even though I wasn't majoring in Chicano Studies, it was education. Like I said, they didn't do, you needed 2 certified teaching disciplines. And mine was Chicano Studies, so they didn't let me get an education degree. It was at that time that when I talked to Dr. Vento, who's in charge of the Center for Mexican Studies, I explained to him and said, you know, they won't give me a degree in education because my second teaching discipline is Chicano Studies. And he basically said, hey, you know what, screw them, man. You know, you don't need a degree in education. He goes, I can give you the degree with all the courses that you've taken right now in Chicano Studies. So I said, just give me the degree in Chicano Studies. But really, nice. I wanted to teach it. I wanted,
yeah.
So, you know, it was.
So 1978, and there's still universities that are fighting to get a Chicano Studies program, you know,
and
to
it's
get
interesting
degrees
though, but
handed
later
out in Chicano
on,
Studies.
they changed that degree, you know, after I left, to a Mexican American Studies degree.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this whole thing with the name, right? Chicano Studies and Mexican American Studies, which for me are the same thing, right? But obviously, the term Chicano is a little more radical and involved with the Chicano movement, and that's my preference, you know, though, you know, I established then later on, 35 years later or something, a Center for Mexican American Studies at Palo Alto College, where I retired from back in 2014, right, before I retired. and the degree in Texas that we fought for, and got the first course approved in Texas. You're talking about years later. The first course for high school students in Mexican-American Studies was approved by the Texas State Board of Education 3 years ago in 2018. We fought for that for 5 years just to get one course approved. Wow. And they finally did. And then last year, the year before, they also now approved an African-American Studies course. So,
and now we're working on the Native American Studies course.
Now we're working on Native American Studies course, which is very important. But just to show you how slow things are and how backwards in a lot of ways education is, and really, you know, one of the things there where I think that we as the Chicano movement kind of failed in that is, while we got Chicano studies and ethnic studies and African-American studies and women's studies, you know, they're in the late 60s and early 70s, got a lot of programs initiated and going and operating throughout the nation. It was primarily at colleges and universities. I think where we failed is that we should have focused more on elementary through the 12th grade. And so important at the elementary level. And I think that we still need to focus a lot more on that, because by the time, you know, our children and our students have gotten to junior high and high school, we've already lost a lot of them. And I think that these courses help them, you know, have this positive image of who they are in history and who they are as an ethnic group, you know, and get outside of all of this racism, you know, institutionalized racism that exists in education and the media and everything. Ethnic studies would go a long way, and we need to institute that as soon as we can at the elementary level throughout our educational system.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely.
And it don't exist right now. You know, it's still very rare at the elementary level and even the junior high level.
So I wanted to go back and sort of touch upon the notion of how we had these different teachers that came up from Mexico during the Chicano movement. Do you think that if the Chicano movement wasn't going on, that first of all, that they would have come up the way they did at the time that they did, and second, that they would have had the same kind of impact that they had, for example, Segura with Danza, Tlacaelel with the Sundance, and Luna Cardenas in this limited capacity at UT with, you know, expounding some of his ideas and philosophies about what it meant to be a Mexica-Azteca?
You know, I don't know. And I imagine that there were other people that came up, you know, prior to the Chicano movement, you know, coming into full force in the mid to late 60s and into the 70s when I was involved. But I definitely think that that the Chicano movement and the whole civil rights movement opened it up for people, not just from Mexico, but throughout the continent, to kind of have to come to terms with, you know, our indigenous connection, you know, to the land, to the spirituality, to the culture of our people, our relatedness to indigenous movements throughout the continent. I know as part of the Chicano movement, like I said, we hooked up with the American Indian movement people. We hooked up with the Black Power movement on different, you know, protests. We hooked up with, and we're in solidarity with the Movimiento Indigenista in Mexico and in Sudamerica, even, and the Movimientos Revolucionarios down there, and El Canto Nuevo, right? You know, that we did a lot of the music of, and hooked up with people from down, you know, Salvador, they're here, Guatemala, you know, Peru, and so forth. So we hooked up with this continental American indigenous movement and the struggles that were going on in these different countries. It was an international and continental solidarity, right? So I think that the civil rights movement and the whole, it was going on really throughout the whole world, but, you know, here in the United States and the Chicano movement as part of it, really opened it up and allowed people, not just Chicanos, but Chicanos to see that, you know, hey, you know, we're fighting for something important. We're fighting for our people, the rights of our people, the human rights issues, you know, the problems that we have in our community, and that these problems exist, in Mexico, they exist in South America, that we're connecting as we're looking for our roots, our indigenous roots. We're connecting to the indigenous movement throughout the whole continent. So it was ripe, is what I'm saying. And I think it really fed this sort of movement and cross-cultural, international, American indigenous movement. And that it manifested itself in a lot of ways. Like I mentioned, El Canto al Pueblo, and ceremonies that we did with different people from both sides of the border, and the American Indian movement and so forth. Those were exciting times, It was the rise also of the whole Chicano cultural renaissance, that the danza was very much a part of, In fact, it was key to us going back to our indigenous roots, right? And indigenous spirituality. And that connection then to the land, right? And then that connection to other American Indians.
And speaking about that, so you're talking about getting involved or working with groups like AIM and connecting with more northern indigenous people. Did you feel like there was active solidarity there within northern natives, like viewing Chicanos as indigenous people, as being part of the same struggle for indigenous rights?
That's a good question, because with some of the groups and some of the tribes and some of the native nations up north, I did feel that solidarity with us. On the other hand, I definitely felt the disconnect with other people, and that certain native groups didn't see, I think, Chicanos and Mexicans as Native American. And at best, probably half-breeds, mestizos, right?
Right.
Mongrels. Spanish, more so than our indigenous languages, right? And then at that time, also in the 70s, when I kind of came of age, not in the 60s, so in the 70s as part of the Chicano movement, we felt that. And there was this whole, well, I'm more native than you are. That still exists, and I'm a full-blood.
Right.
And you're Mexican, you're not native, and little by little, I think that concept has begun to change, though that still exists even to this day. But I think, certain scholars played important roles in disseminating that concept, and little by little people opened up that this is more a continental movement. And there's a lot of different original native groups throughout, and that we have this connection, and that we should be in solidarity with these liberation movements and across the continent, and I think for the most part, people de conciencia, right, and people of the movement had that solidarity, whereas other people that maybe weren't as much movement as others were, didn't see us as native people.
There's always a spectrum. Everything always flows in the spectrum. Yeah. So I know we've probably come up to the end of the hour here. Did you have any last minute comments about anything that we've touched upon, or maybe something that we didn't ask that you wanted to say, whether it's about Luna Cardenas, the courses you took, about Danza Segura, Tlacaelel, or anything else that you think is pertinent to our discussion here today?
I think we've talked about a lot of important things, I have done some, and I know you have, Ruben Tlacaltecatl, and you, Kurly, también have worked on doing work and writings and some scholarly work also on the influence of the Mexica-Azteca and the Danza de los Concheros and other danza amongst the Chicanos and the Chicano movement. But I don't think enough has been written about it, of the integration of the danza into the Chicano movement and the important role that it played, as I mentioned, really connect us in a lot of ways to our indigenous spiritual roots, religious roots, that kind of fulfilled this part of this conciencia of the Chicano movement and those spiritual roots, and moving back to our land that were so very important. in a fuller, more complex. How did the danza Mexica-Azteca, and I know you mentioned, Kurly, that maybe we shouldn't call it Mexica-Azteca, but I think that it is more Mexica-Azteca because other tribes and nations, indigenous nations that weren't Azteca had their own danzas and música and lenguaje and cultura, you know, depending on from which area you go to the Maya to the south or up here al norte. You know, so it's important that we recognize the diversity of the different indigenous groups. And I think that that's where we have to go back and really research and do genealogy and so forth, our own indigenous roots, to see that, you know, because we're mixed even a lot of times in our own indigenous blood, not to count then the Espanol and other, you know, even black blood sometimes through lado del Espanol that we have. But we're mixed. I came to find out, I came around full circle that when I left the danza back in about 1985 or so, after being in it for 9 years as jefe, segundo, Xinachtli, part of it was to kind of really try to find my true roots, notice that I didn't have this connection to the Aztecas. And I came to find out that I do have, on my father's side, Martinez Tejeda, you know, what they call now Coahuiltecan blood from the different groups here in San Antonio, because they've been here since before the Españoles came, right? And then we do have some Español-sided bloods that are intermarried with some of our, you know, grandmothers. But I asked Andres Segura one time, because we were at one of the ceremonies and we were in his little apartment in Mexico City. And he looked at Jose Flores. We were getting to go to ceremony and getting our vestuario together. And he, so he looks sort of, you know, very Mexica. And then of course, I didn't have my goatee back then, you know, but I had my bigote, and I say, "Yo, maestro, you know, ¿cómo me miro? You know, ¿a qué me miro? You know." And he looks at me like that, and he looks at me for a while, and he goes, "Tú pareces Tlaxcalteca." And I thought he was fucking with me because, you know, the Tlaxcaltecas were the enemies of the Aztecs, right? You know, perennial enemies. And of course, Andres Segura was bien Mexica, you know, tradición y todo.
Some of the origins of what we know as the danza conchera as originating independently in, you know, Tlaxcala territories or places that were settled by Tlaxcalteca. But you also have the story, that, like the basic story of the danza, how it came to be, is about how Tlaxcaltecas and other Christianized Indians were coming in and trying to do the same to you know, unconquered peoples like the Otomi and the Chichimeca, and a lot of those happen to be Tlaxcalteca Indians. And so there's the Tlaxcalteca play an important role in the mythology of the danza conchera. So there's something to that. There's definitely something to that.
So the first time I went to Chalma, I mentioned and met Andres Segura. That first night that we were in Chalma and set up our camp, we Andres took like 6 of us to the templo in Malinalco, because Malinalco is just right there by Chalma, right? And that was quite an experience to be there with Andres Segura. In a lot of ways, this later came back. I came to realize that it was an initiation of sorts that Andres did with certain one of people of his group. It's important. I mean, these teachings, you know, they stay with you, even though you don't. I'm not a complete Mexica-Azteca, and I know how Mexicanos and have glorified the Aztecas, and I understand the reasons behind it. It's still an important culture, important teachings, important civilization, you know, but there's a lot of civilizations, and that, you know, Mexicanos are comprised of a lot of different indigenous groups, and we're a mixture. even
Right.
mixture with our enemies, like I am, and the Azteca, and the Tlaxcalteca, and the Españoles y todos, but at the same time, we've created something new, and I think that we need to realize that, study it, and I think that the work y'all are doing is very important because we're demythifying, and just getting to the truth, right? Of our history, of our culture, of our spirituality, right? Our belief, our language. So the work that y'all are doing is very important. And I agree with you clearly that we don't have to tell these lies that kind of build up, the Mexica or other indigenous cultures, because the actual truth is so much more powerful that we don't have to build it up. They were already great civilizations that had great cultures and arts and language and societies, that just tell the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good place to end the interview. Something positive said about me. Now I can tell my wife. That's where it ends.